Thank you very much, Ambassador Dogra. I mean, that's only an honor that we would have liked to avoid, but anyway, this is true that we have been dealing with terrorism. But this is not the question here. The question is, how do we find some sort of a vaguely original approach to something which has been discussed at length in the literature and in the previous conversation? I mean, I would like to try to take a slightly more prospective view on what's going on in AFPAC and beyond. I mean, the introduction to this session started in the end of the caliphate in the Levant. That is the end of the territorial control of a significant part of Syria and Iraq. And I think that the question that we have to ask ourselves today is, are we facing today collectively a problem of a different nature in the region as we did before? And there are a number of reasons, whatever the answer, there are a number of reasons to ask this question, as they may help us understand how things could evolve, at least some of these questions. First of all, I'd like to challenge a little bit the assumption under this session, which is that AFPAC is the epicenter of terrorism today. AFPAC remains a very, if not the prime center of for global terror, but this is no longer the only one. And if you have opened up the papers about Southeast Asia last summer, especially about Marawi, there are questions to be asked. And for the very same reason, the return of fighters from ISIS to the region. I mean, what happened in Marawi is not innocent. There were not just people from the region. There were people also coming from the Arabic Peninsula, and that is meaningful of a real globalization. The extent is still to be decided, but nevertheless, this is something. This is in no way an attempt to dilute the importance of AFPAC. This is just a way to say that if you consider that you do have a series of country-to-country relationship between those movements, the problem has increased. And we are facing a problem of almost unprecedented scale. And this scale will by itself raise problems of its own. The second question that it does raise is linked to the very idea which is behind it. Why can we compare Mindanao, for example, in Afghanistan or Pakistan? Because there is the question of territorial control. I mean, there we have the southern Philippine island where the government doesn't exercise any real control and has not done it for years, where there is a real power vacuum, and that's where the insurgency is taking place. And that's where now the returnees are going, right? We are almost in a similar situation in Afghanistan, at least for part of the country, and we are in a much more ambiguous situation, but part of it can be compared to it in Pakistan as well. The question of territorial control is essential for bad guys to regroup, refund, reorganize, replan. So this is not something which is unimportant. In Pakistan, of course, the question is to stop the country from being used for as a sanctuary. And there we have had the discussion about the US policy. I'm not going to go into that again, but this is very much what is at stake right now. I think that some of the challenges that Chris has highlighted are very true, and I do share them. And in Afghanistan, of course, the goal is to prevent the country to become again a sanctuary. I mean, will it be successful? This is already questionable for a number of reasons. This is not the 4% that are mentioned in the introductory booklet. This is much more than is actually being controlled by the Taliban today. So the question is very much there. The question of territorial control also raised directly and indirectly the issue of what will be the relationship between the various organizations in the future. I mean, in the 90s, at the end of the 90s, post-Soviet withdrawal and so on, there was one question which was haunting academic circles and policy-making circles alike. Are we facing something like an Islamic Comintern, which suppose both a convergence of objective and a chain of command? And by and large, the answer was no. We knew what the process was. I mean, aspiring terrorists from almost every country would come to this specific country because there was a power vacuum, and then would regroup, retrain, refund, blah, 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 go back to their own cause and fight again. But there was no real unity, even though there were eventually common ideologies and convergence occasionally. Today we can ask the same question and we will partly arrive at the same answer, with one major difference though, that in between we have had the creation of two organizations with global aspiration, one being Al-Qaeda of course and one being Daesh. Now, why do I say that the question of territorial control matters in this context? Simply because the big difference between Daesh and Al-Qaeda was about territorial control. Now, what kind, with the caliphate gone? I mean, the idea of the caliphate itself has changed. This is much less for Daesh an earthy matter. The word is still used, but it's used in a very different thing, right? So are we likely to see some sort of rapprochement between Daesh and Al-Qaeda? Again, there is no answer, but this is a question which is worth asking because you see two very different situations. If you look at Southeast Asia, then you do have situations where Al-Qaeda and Daesh actually cooperate. If you look at Afghanistan, you do have Al-Qaeda acting on its own and regrouping, refunding, everything, but acting on its own. Now, what you do have in Afghanistan is the same question of territoriality being asked about the relation between Daesh and the Taliban. And there we have no single answer either, because we do have situations where the two fight each other for the control of resources and power, and we do have situations where they do actually cooperate. Now, I see the criticism coming. It was expressed by Mr. Hematoullah yesterday, which say, well, this is all the same thing. This is a way to convince the international community that the Taliban are a more acceptable force than Daesh. And I sympathize partly with the argument. I think there is absolutely every reason to believe that within that game, like in every single game in South Asia, there is manipulation by the usual suspect. You take the kind of affiliation that you see going from TTP to Daesh, and vice versa, by the way, occasionally. You take LEG, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, moving to Daesh, and interestingly, of course, fighting the usual sectarian thing, but also you fighting Baluch separatists in Balochistan. And then you start asking, at the very least, what's going on there. So I won't go any further for in order to remain vaguely diplomatic, but I think these are real questions. But I mean, the question is still a valid one for another reason. The question is still a valid one because, as Ambassador just said, you do have a number of returnees from other nationalities as well. And whatever their future, whether they get involved into the local group, and that's very much a possibility because nobody arrives in Afghanistan or elsewhere in a vacuum. You arrive in a place where there is already sort of a jihadi landscape, which has been said by previous far. And therefore you adapt to it your own way, in different way, in a confrontational way or in a cooperative one, but I mean, you do have to adjust to the reality of the country. So we may well face a situation where those returnees will actually fight other people's battle. That too was the rule in the 90s. You paid whatever you due was for having been sheltered by whatever groups were sheltering you by fighting alongside them for a while before going back to your own country. So we may face the same kind of situation, but I mean, we may face also a number of other situations. What I'm trying to say is that kind of relation, if you take out the manipulation component, which is very much there, I insist on that, but which is definitely not unique, then you may face a very fluid and very different situation in a few years from now, or even in a few months from now. So I think that's a question which is worth asking. Now I'd like to go to another element which very much goes in the same direction Professor Dorsey was going this morning. When you do have groups basically acting within the same ideological matrix, does ideology matters anymore? What we see here is a great deal of fight, of greed and lust for power, and nothing else in many cases. So I don't think we should be too focused on those ideological questions, because once you have said that, well, this is all Wahhabi and Salafis and wah, then what do you say? And how does that help you, really? What this idea of counter-narrative is for? Not much, actually. For a number of sociological as well as very practical questions. I mean, we are not facing theology and arguing all the time for whatever idea is most fashionable right now. We're facing a reality where balance of power on the ground actually decide the affiliations. I mean, part of the seduction of Daesh, for example, be it in Afghanistan, Pakistan, or elsewhere, was linked to the narrative of victory. But in this narrative of victory, victory was much more important than the ideology which was supposed to rationalize behind. So that's something which I believe is important as well. Now, I've mentioned already the relations with the Taliban, I mentioned this. I won't be any longer because we are already close to the end of the session. Let me just conclude by one thing. And again, I will concur with Professor Dorsey, which is, you know, it's no coincidence if the countries most affected by terrorism today, or contributed the most to terrorism today, because of course you all have Pakistan in mind, are the least democratic in the region, right? It doesn't mean that democracy itself is a guarantee against terrorism. I mean, I come from a country which pretends to be democratic, and yet we have been affected by terrorism in a big way in recent times. Well, the question is really that different. First of all, democratic country tends to be more resilient, providing it's both democratic and pluralistic. So the preservation of that is something important. Second, what we see in the variety of situations that we can observe all over Asia, for example, is that it's ultimately linked to a number of local political situations. So a political answers to political problems, which are themselves the reason of the frustration of a number of people joining ISIS and so on, is perhaps a prerequisite. Ideologues you will always have of whatever kinds. But I mean, and we can probably not eradicate political violence there too, I agree with you, sir. But it can be contained, providing we do accept to address the problem as they are and the nature of the problem that we have to address. And I will stop on that. Thank you.